Welcome back to Wired for Change. I'm your host, Amy Yee. If you've ever been the person in the room who speaks up first, who sees the need for change first, or who carries the weight of transformation on your shoulders, you may feel seen in this episode. My guest today is Jill Reilly. She is the author of the upcoming book, The 10 Permissions. Her career spans 3 decades of personal and social change, from post-conflict zones to corporate boardrooms, and her message for us is both radical and grounding, that we must first give ourselves permissions to change before we can expect the systems around us to change. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today, especially because early in my career, I experienced a hesitation in speaking, and it was noticed by my boss at the time. And she asked me, Amy, when we're one-on-one, you've got so many great ideas and so much to talk about, but we're in the boardroom. You're so quiet. Why is that? And so I took the time with a wonderful coach that I've been working with at the time, and she helped me understand that I first needed to give myself permission, and it was permission to be wrong. And I think that there are many of us who experience this struggle with not ever being able to be wrong in front of other people. Like, will it hurt our credibility? What's that going to do for the transformation? Or, maybe I don't feel safe in being wrong. And so that's something that really drew me to Jill Reilly and her book in terms of giving permission, because it's something that I had never considered at the time. And after I gave myself permission, things really changed for me. So, Jill, thank you so much for coming to be a guest, for us on the show today. Really looking forward to the conversation, and welcome.
Oh, thank you, Amy. I'm thrilled to be here, and particularly with that opening that you've shared. I think the fact that you have explored the theme of permission in your own life and have your own experience of what that feels like and the sort of space that it creates in your life means that I think we've got a great starting point for this.
Thank you so much, Jill. So, what drew you into change work in the first place?
Oh, $1 million question, Amy, because it started early. I was, as a young woman, I was still I was a senior at Northwestern University. I felt like I wanted to have a purpose-led career, if you will, something that felt like it made a difference, to use jargon. Um, and South Africa was going through its transition to democracy. The 1994 elections that would see Nelson Mandela come into power were upcoming. And for reasons that I quite honestly cannot explain, I decided that I had to get to South Africa to be a part of that process. And once I did that, once I managed to take myself from Midwestern America to a country deep in transition, I think there was something in me that just became fascinated with this idea of what does it take for us to kind of reinvent ourselves. I mean, people at that time were talking about the new South Africa, and I was like, wow, can a country make itself new again? And then that theme sort of then led to communities, individuals, organizations, when so many of us want to kind of, move into new space, become something other than what we've always been. I just became fascinated with that and with my potential role in it.
And so what triggered kind of was it what you expected, I guess? Were you surprised? Did your experience there shift kind of your understanding of change and what barriers there are to change?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think I probably walked in with a hugely, one might say, naive, possibly entitled opinion that it was sort of an if-then equation. If I and my colleagues were to present the appropriate amount of resource, be that money or facts or training or whatever it was, then it would result, in the desired outcome. That human beings were that simplistic, if you will, that you could just sort of pull some levers and make change. And as much as, of course, that wasn't something I'd ever experienced in my own life, I think at a young age, I felt that I would potentially have the power to do that. And, needless to say, my experience was that it was far more complex than that. And that's part of the journey for me towards permission, was that, I came to realize that my role as an external agent, if you will, as you've already described, was almost far less important than whatever that internal conversation and transformation that was taking place. And that, I was very humbled at a very early age to really kind of realize the limitations of my own power.
Hmm. I think that's such an important message, and something that probably strikes a lot of people who walk into change. Do you have any particular aha moments that you could share?
Um, yeah, I mean, what I often reference is just my experience working on the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Zimbabwe, which at the time was the world's biggest epidemic. And, people were throwing so much money at it. And I was a very young director of a very well-funded program,
Mhm.
millions and millions and millions at my disposal. And I was under a lot of pressure to move those resources as quickly as I could. And I think that what started to happen to me was that I started to feel, compromised by this idea that if I just applied more pressure, if you will, to the problem, it would fix itself. When actually what I could see was precisely the opposite. That maybe what we needed was to allow more time, to allow for a more organic change process to unfold in the hearts and minds of so many different individuals and so many different families and couples and communities. But of course, people don't have the patience for that. We want it to be linear. We want it to be predictable. We want it to have a firm beginning, middle, and end. And I think once I kind of could see that there is no human change that is linear and predictable, it all takes its own path. I knew I had to step away from that line of work, if you will,
Mhm.
and reflect a lot on what my role would be in trying to help catalyze change in individuals, organizations, and communities around the world.
Hmm. And you've said that the 10 permissions was born out of burnout and confusion. Could you elaborate on that? It seems like a bit of a path that we're taking here from that challenging
Yeah.
situation.
Oh yeah, that was burnout and confusion right there that I've just
Mhm.
described. It was born of, and I can almost remember the day. And I have discussed this in other forums where I was with my colleague who was with the donor that was funding us, and he was kind of putting all this pressure on me to say, "Come on, do more, give more, try harder." And my response to him was, I can give everybody all the things, all the money, all the resources, all the training. I can't give them permission. They have to decide on their own timeline when they're prepared, to use your framing for this conversation, to be the first. Because that's what it takes in any sort of change process. Somebody has to have this very intimate moment with themselves where they're like, okay, I'm going to have the conversation. I'm going to speak up. Your own process that you've described of, I'm going to share the thing that I'm afraid to share. So that willingness to confront the fear of rejection, failure, lack of approval, that's a very personal negotiation you undertake with yourself. And in that space, I was like, wow, that's where the kind of turnkey is. It's not everything I throw at it. It's the conditions I create for people to kind of decide for themselves that they're prepared to go to a place they've never been before. So yeah, it was out of that I started to go, okay, what does that look like? What does that feel like for people?
And along those lines, I mean, I can imagine sort of knowing that for yourself, that giving of permission is something that, is something that you can unlock for yourself. How did you know that this same problem applied to other people, that other people were challenged by this? How did you find that out?
Well, I think when you come up against the same failure over and over again, you start to say, what's going on here? And everybody knows that there's this gap in between a recognition that something has to change and the change actually taking place. I mean, as you say, anybody who's worked in a change process will go, huh, interesting. We got called in to address X. We had all the answers, we had all the resources, we had all the right responses. And yet, when it comes down to actual behavior change, there's a gap. And that's because no matter what, somebody says they want, or no matter how much, if we can shift in context of many of the organizational consultancies I would do, where the so-called boss would, say, we need culture change. We need our staff to be more, empowered and engaged. And then you'd sit in the room and see people kind of with their hands in their laps going, really? You know, and for me, the implicit question was always, am I really allowed?
Mm-hmm.
Am I really allowed to do the thing that you say you want? Because up until now, I haven't been. So, what is it going to take for me to feel safe to be the first to do the things that none of us have ever done before? And that realization that, there's a spark that has to kind of spark in people individually in order for some sort of collective new conversations to take place. I watched that over and over and over again. So, the consistent failings, if you will, of change to result in the outcomes that were desired led me to say, okay, there's a very granular, intimate thing that we're missing here in these kind of grand initiatives to make things different. And it's hard to get at, and it takes time, and it takes intention, and it takes a commitment. But to me, when you get there, well, then all of a sudden, you're opening up the kinds of spaces that you really want.
It's really interesting. Actually, in my very first episode of this podcast, I looked at this a little bit just in terms of, why is it so hard for behavioral change to take place? What is this mystery? Because there's always more resistance, than you think. When it comes to the individuals who who might speak up first or who might ask a question kind of thing in the room, I think we've all been in these rooms where there's always one or two individuals who are kind of more prone to speaking up first. Have you looked at kind of the differences that that make that possible for some people more than others? Is it is it sometimes personality? Are there other factors? Is it sometimes some people just feel more safe because of their position in an organization? What are some of the drivers? Like, what does it take to act when others hesitate?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've just named two of the reasons that people do. Some people's personalities are more inclined towards that. Their position allows them to feel safe. I mean, what we're basically looking at is, what does it take for you to feel safe, or to be able to absorb the discomfort that comes along with whatever the ripple will be from what you've said. And so I think for a lot of people, they will have had. So I see this as a sort of discomfort tolerance, if you will, that is earned.
Hmm.
I think more often than not, it is more a product of experience than it is some innate set of qualities. Um, and I'm discounting the complete outliers who might always have something to say. But in terms of, people who will be earlier rather than later in the conversation, I think probably they have at some point earlier than the rest of us started to dip a toe in to that, saying the thing, doing the thing, and then learning that while the result might not be 100% pleasant or positive, or exactly as one would want it to be, they are able to continue on in any case. So they start to develop a tolerance that says, it's okay if Amy's a little bit angry at me for the next day. That doesn't mean that our relationship is ruptured. So their sense of identity isn't as sort of conditioned on other people's approval. They feel more confident that they can ride out, whatever sort of ruptures there might be. And I really do believe that that is something that a kind of muscle that you can choose to develop over time, and it can start small. The problem is most of us don't, because we're never encouraged to. We are, very programmed to be easy, compliant, complacent, that for good reason. That was how, we've been rewarded. I mean, we wanted to protect the status quo. And so, there wasn't always a tremendous incentive in challenging it. So, I think we've been very much conditioned to one, protect the status quo, to believe that protecting that means that we, largely say yes to whatever the prevailing set of rules is. Um, and three, we haven't really enabled ourselves to gain the experience of challenging things and realizing that, we can handle whatever the outcomes are. Part of the point of the book is that in a volatile world, um, we need that discomfort tolerance more than ever because we're going to have to be having a lot more complex conversations. We might have differences of opinion, and compliance and conformity isn't necessarily rewarded, or it isn't, the strategy that it once was. People aren't looking to hang around in positions for their entire career. They're happy to move through things with a little more fluidity. So yeah, I'm really kind of encouraging people to test themselves, gain a comfort, gain a kind of muscle for that being the first.
That's great. And then in thinking about, the role of a transformation leader as well and the complexity, of that. I mean, often a transformation leader is brought into an organization. They're given kind of like you were when you talked about being a director, they're given this enormous kind of pressure and responsibility to usher in a huge change that generally people
Yeah,
aren't ready for because they don't have those muscles. Like usually if you need a really big
yeah,
change, it's because you've stayed the same for a very long time, right?
right, exactly.
And it's interesting to think about just how many challenges there are because I mean you're changing yourself, you're trying to understand the change. Everyone is kind of, being rewarded on the behaviors that they have, had for a very long time and they're invested
Right,
in the status quo,
right,
right?
of
That's
course.
what feels safe. And so there are so many different things to unlock in terms of, how people work, how people have conversations, what is open to question and what's staying the same kind of thing, right? So there's a lot going
Yeah,
on there where I think there may be all kinds of permissions that people need to give themselves or people need to understand how to give themselves or recognize that. And so you talk about 10 permissions, in the book. I wonder if you could give us a bit of a sense of like the range of permissioning or where those ideas came from for you.
yeah. I mean, I think the main theme of them is sort of how do we become more adaptive and responsive and creative in our choice making and in our life design in a world that's requiring it. So, what you've just referenced, I think, is so important that what happens when you've been holding on to the status quo for a long time, and inevitably that starts to create problems, is that then you think, oh, we need a big solution to this big problem. And, one of the metaphors that I use is that, at that stage, as you said, you have no lived experience of it, you have no muscle, and you've never been rewarded for it. So how are you ever going to do it? I say it's like trying to do a high jump from standing still. You can't. You've never done anything like it. So in many ways, what I'm kind of inviting people to do is to imagine kind of oiling their own adaptivity a little bit more. Gaining that muscle, gaining that experience for not waiting and holding on until all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, I need big change. I need to make a big move because we all know it doesn't happen in the way that we want to. So the 10 permissions are sort of built out around that. Everything from, and they're each also, I will say, kind of cheekily intended to get you to think about flipping a lot of the scripts that you might be carrying around with consciously or unconsciously on their heads.
Mhm.
So, for instance, the first one, be willful. I think we've all kind of carried around this idea that a willful child or a willful person is problematic. They get in the way, they're annoying, they're demanding, they might be selfish. And what I'm trying to say is that in this kind of world, if you aren't willful, if you are not tapped into and working from a place of want, then you're going to miss out on all the best opportunities.
Mhm.
You're going to hesitate. You're going to be slow. You might outsource that want to 1,000 different places and then feel overwhelmed. That because the reward structure for compliance and conformity is unraveled, we need to kind of come back into a state of, I want, and I'm going to go and create. It doesn't mean it's going to work out. It doesn't mean everybody else is going to applaud us, but it means that at least we're walking out into the world clear in our intent and able to then co-create, negotiate, collaborate with a sense of clear contribution. Um, that for me is sort of a foundational permission. And they move through how you move out into the world, prepared to learn from it, engage with it, adapt alongside it, and learn to kind of make your best contributions to it as the world changes around you. So the last one is make believe. And to me, those sort of bookend the 10. And I describe that as make what you believe in and believe you can make things, because I truly do believe, particularly now, the world is requiring us and inviting us to move into it with a generative intent. We will not be filling pre-prepared roles the way that we have been. A lot of those are going to be replaced. And everything is sort of organizing around us to say, okay, what do you want to create? What can you create? And that doesn't have to be our own business. It can be a novel solution to an existing problem. It can be a way of working that we haven't necessarily thought about before. But your mindset has to shift from I'm executing on a set of familiar commands to I'm moving into a space where I'm thinking about how to do things differently, how to use this, AI resource at my fingertips to make something that doesn't currently exist. And that requires permission because we haven't been trained to see ourselves that way. So yeah, it's kind of how we thrive in a world that's asking us to operate very, very differently from how our parents did.
Absolutely. It's quite a topic, and one
Yeah.
that I think many of us are watching carefully every day. What you say makes so much sense, and yet it can still be hard to do. Let's talk a little bit about the social cost of change a little bit.
Mm,
Um, I've had conversations where even the idea of being the contrarian in a meeting where maybe you feel like the answer is actually no, but you want to go along with the group, for example. And that's just one
sure.
very small example, but what's the toll of being perceived as willful, as you say, or difficult, or making your own path, or being very intentional to the point where others may feel like they're being left out? Is there a social cost to that impacts your ability to give yourself permission?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, you are obviously breaking a mold to some extent, a mold that will be, harder and more fixed depending upon who you are and where you've come from and where you are in your life. So, I think that cost looks different for everybody. Um, I think the flip side of the cost is the benefit to self.
Mhm.
And so, when I talk to young people, which I do often because a lot of this for me is particularly relevant for them, and I talk about the fact that I deeply disappointed my parents at a very early age. My parents wanted me to go to law school. They had big dreams for me. And I had a series of conversations with them around our kitchen table that were excruciating.
Mhm.
I had no answers that would satisfy them. There was no way that I felt like I was going to make them proud with the decisions that I was making. And it was tough. I'm not going to lie. Within that space, there's this coming into self, which is okay, how are we doing this? You know, are we are we making a conscious decision to act without approval? And when you make that decision, and in my case, I didn't need their money, I didn't need anything from them. I'd organized everything on my own. And when you realize that their approval is desirable but not required, that is a game changer because all of a sudden you're like, well, yeah, I mean, it's not great that they're a little bit disillusioned with what their daughter's become. But on the other hand, I've never been clearer about who I am. So, in that space where the cost is other people understanding you and approving of you, you are getting to know yourself better than you ever have. And that for me is so worth it because from that space, And again, and this is something that I say in the book, I didn't enter into that conversation with a finger in the air to authority. I wasn't setting out to be some rebel. As I say, it's not kind of F you, it's yay me. I'm not trying to disrupt the system. I'm trying to listen to my internal voice. If that disrupts the system as a consequence, I'm sorry, but this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. And that self knowledge, that self approval, that acceptance of self, whew, I mean, that will get you so much farther than attempting to please people, attempting to satisfy a system that, if you are that wanting to say something, you are not satisfied with that system to start with. And you continuing to muzzle yourself and squash your own desire in order to seek its rewards will eventually burn you out. And you will come out the other side without any idea of where to go next. Because the longer that you stay in those things, the harder it is to come out and listen in again. So I really, really want, people to consider that when they are holding on tight to situations that compromise them, that you're losing so much. Um, and you can gain so much if you're just willing to deal with a little bit of discomfort, not or potentially a lot.
Mhm.
But what is that going to get you on the flip side?
How does that relate to change fatigue or just fatigue in general? Because I think we've talked about burnout, for example. So, grappling with self doubt, for instance, is that something that you would say is more draining? And then getting past kind of the discomfort and becoming empowered, would you say that's more energy giving? Just wondering about, what you've seen in terms of the dynamics there with respect to energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think self-doubt is hugely draining because what self-doubt leads to is inaction, and inaction is wildly draining. There is nothing more draining than sitting in a situation where there's a block in between you and the thing you want to do or say or affect. You have essentially, outsourced your agency to whatever system you're in. And from that place, that is tremendously disempowering. And energy is a function of power. So, to my mind, I am never more energized than when I'm taking small steps through the thing that is challenging me or scaring me or frightening me. So, if I'm in a situation where I feel I can't confront, if you will, or engage with the thing that I really want to, but it scares me too much, I would start to look at how to take action, in the current situation. So, steps to either find alternatives, steps to put it to the side and begin to feed myself in other ways. But I really, really want people to be wary of the cost of inaction, because the longer it carries on, the harder it is to correct, the harder it is to then find what you need within you to, kickstart the kind of action that you want to take. Um, Action breeds energy because it creates momentum, even again, if it's not some sort of resolution to a bigger situation that might be troubling you, you are reminded of your agency. And so a lot of I have a workbook that goes along with my book that's all about tiny steps, micro experiments in sort of taking action, because it's those things that can happen, on your weekends, in your off hours, that remind you that you have choice and the power to make it. And you've got to keep kindling that belief, because when you lose that, that's when you lose all your energy.
So let's imagine that I'm someone who is thinking that maybe I need to try this a little bit. What would your advice be to me in terms of, you know that micro permission I can give myself just as a first step to get started?
Yeah. First of all, I talk a lot about starting on your weekends.
Okay.
We tend to always look at, our work and our job and our career and our purpose and all these things that are like super high consequence.
Right.
And so they breed inaction, they breed fear. Forget about those.
Okay.
So start to give yourself micro permissions within the confines of your existing life. You don't have to change anything. because this is not about fixing problems or changing current conditions. Once we start to get into that mind frame, it feels very high stakes. We want to lower the temperature. We want to create an environment where I start to not fix a problem, but cultivate a capability within myself. So I would start on a weekend, and much as I would if I was trying to start a new fitness regime, I might say, I'm going to go for a little walk. I'm going to start moving my body. What I talk about in my workbook is I'm going to start making intentional decisions about small things that nobody else even has to know about. Like really listening into, what do I feel like having for lunch today? Like, think about it. I know what I normally do, but can I access a feeling around that that just is like, and then can I act on that? Am I willing to act? Is there a lag? Is there a sort of hesitation around that? So for me, the micro permissions are at first low consequence, even high pleasure. Like, it's okay.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be hard. It can feel good. Guess what? It can be just super intentional around stuff that feels good, because that starts to create a virtuous cycle of, this choice making is nice. This agency feels good. I can then take it to things that maybe feel not so good, if you will, a little more uncomfortable. Like, I'm going to try and do something new that I haven't done before that I might worry about. I'm going to go to a part of town that I never go to. I'm going to join a group where I might feel odd walking in on the first day. But people underestimate the extent to which these are virtuous cycles. And the repatterning starts from the smallest place and builds. And that's the piece of sort of change, and that's the piece of growth that I think we so often underestimate as adults. It's problem led, it's painful, it's high stakes, it's visible. And I want everybody to just put that aside for a little while, because I think we're all overwhelmed and stressed. Play around on the kind of edges of their lives with things that I guarantee will start to bear fruit in ways that they couldn't necessarily anticipate.
I really like that focus you put on, how did you make yourself feel or how did you feel after doing this? I think
Mhm.
we spend a lot of time thinking about how we've made other people feel, but not necessarily about, how we've made ourselves feel. We get very focused on outcomes, for example. So I think that's very powerful and something that is easy to remember, to try and to be conscious about. So thank you for that. Um, what does it feel? Let's talk a little bit more about leadership. What does it feel like to lead others? Or what does it look like to lead others without having figured all of this out or having given yourself permission for everything?
I call it sort of more explorer, less executive. Like, I think that's such a critical reframe for us now in the sort of leadership realm, is there the old school sort of, I know, I am guide, I am out in front, I have answers, I have vision, I inspire. And I think that there are a lot of people right now who are suffering and feeling like they don't measure up to some idea they have in their head of what leading looks like. And I think once you give permission yourself this sense of engaging with your default story and working out whether it still serves you and how you can start to make changes to it, you realize that we're all sort of finding our way through things. Um, that there's a lot of stuff that's unraveling, that there's a lot of ways that we're making things up as we go and we're trying new things. And so for me, it's an embrace of sort of complexity, of stepping into the unknown, of accepting the fact that there is no longer one path and no right way. There are choices and consequences. And so, I think leadership today is a hugely exploratory relational act of, finding our way together and letting ourselves off the hook for always having to, get it right, have the right answer, know, respond, do. Um, there's a kind of cushy or space in which we sort of are working through things together. And I know a lot of people go, oh, that sounds very muddy and
Mhm.
inefficient. But I actually think at the other side of that is the space to actually discover, new ways of doing things, better ways of doing things. People are less afraid. And so when you're less afraid, you're far more creative, you're far more energized, you're far more sort of willing to give a little bit more. And, I think that's what a lot of us don't ever experience is the absence of that fear. And you open this up so beautifully in describing what happened to you when you started to engage with that fear
Mhm.
and the room that you suddenly feel to offer something of yourself that before felt off limits. So I think there's hugely sort of rich space that comes when people have more room to bring parts of themselves that previously felt like they weren't allowed.
Absolutely. And so leaders can model this behavior and talk about it. But it sounds like there's also a role for leaders to open up that space and to perhaps pay attention to their staff, like mine did, in terms of, this is seems like a seems like a gap. You're different now with
Yeah.
me than you are with other people, and for them to tune in and to think about their staff, very personally, if they can, and that has a long-term payout. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, 100%. Just that observational quality,
Mhm.
that care, that, attention and intention. It's so I think what's happened is, our individual selves have come out from behind roles over the past 20 years or so. We've gone from being the accountant or the ad exec or the blah, 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 the role that anybody could fill, and we were interchangeable to becoming individuals who happen to occupy a certain function within a team. And to me, if you are not, as a leader, observing the individuals that comprise your team and figuring out how to get the best out of them, then I don't know what you're doing.
Mhm.
That is literally all you're there to do. Because so much has become more improvisational, innovative, figuring things out, changing things around. The arc from the kind of industrial era, just do things over and over and over again, to, the need to be more generative and creative means that you've got to know what each person has to offer and how they function best. Because they're not just part of an assembly line. They are, a human component to a creative process more likely than not. And that doesn't have to be capital C creative. It can just mean that we're trying to figure out how to do this better in hugely disruptive times. So, number one job to me for a leader is how do I, understand what gets my people to want to and feel able to make their best contribution?
Hmm. It makes me wonder about how to design a culture like this. And I think, you have to acknowledge that different organizations are starting in different places, and they're working with different challenges. So, an organization that's very well established and very status quo and very, um, current process oriented kind of thing will be starting in one place. Um, and then a new organization, a startup, let's say, that's coming together, is going to be starting perhaps at a different place, but they may also have challenges with respect to they haven't formed relationships yet, or maybe they're all working remotely. And so, what are some ideas that you have in terms of how do you design that workplace culture around this idea of the 10 permissions that you have? Any tips you would share, or any lines of thinking that you would share?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're working in times where being super intentional about the way that you work together is more important than ever because we've got five generations in the workplace,
Mhm.
all of whom have very different ideas about what work looks like, what it should look like, how we're allowed to behave, what we're allowed to do. The unraveling of work norms puts tremendous pressure on leaders to continue to kind of create sticky environments where people can and want to come together to do their best work. So one of the things I do is what I call sort of, because the subtitle of my book is rewriting the rules for the adulting in the 21st century. So, I get teams to sort of talk about, well, what are the rules for how we work together?
Mhm.
And it's like, oh, do we have rules? Well, you certainly have rules. I mean, and the vast majority of them are unwritten, right? It's kind of your way. And I think when we were in more hierarchical, more top down environments, these types of conversations weren't as relevant. But I think given the fluidity of the situation, I would encourage every leader to get super explicit about things that were once implicit. So, rules of operating. There's so much confusion right now. Am I allowed? And forget about work from home, not work from home. How is it okay if make a decision of a day to stay at home for a few hours and get some things done? Or is that going to be viewed um, poorly by the people around me? Things that are from the sort of functional to the relational. Because I think there's so much confusion around what we think is allowed right now, and it's causing a lot of conflict. Is all over every business publication. It's causing confusion, hesitation, resentment. You know, so I would get very explicit about rules. Have conversations about what are they. Do we agree on them? Are we prepared to operate by these? And then, how do we then sort of come up with a way of operating together that feels right, that feels productive, that feels, like it's a reflection of who's in the room, not just some textbook. And keep tapping into those. I mean, I would have a monthly meeting on a Friday afternoon or whatever, where it was just checking in, constant routine check ins. You need to be more focused on routine adaptation than periodic correction. So, whatever you can do to fuel that routine adaptation is in your best interest. And to me, that's quality of conversation, intentionality of sort of process are the two key things that I would come to for that. And then, see what comes out of that.
I really like the way that you framed the idea of routine adaptation as opposed to routine correction, right?
Mm,
There's a
mm.
big difference there, and I've been in teams where we had a great kind of first meeting and talked about the rules of engagement and how we work together and what rhythms we wanted based on what we wanted to achieve. But then eventually they kind of fell by the wayside a bit, and nobody really
Of
talked
course,
about it because it was uncomfortable to talk about it. And then we felt like we were failing at our own rules.
of course. Yeah.
And then it became a wild west, even though we had had that first great conversation about, the rules, and maybe they made sense at the time, but maybe they didn't make sense after a while. And the idea that that's okay
Mm.
and we've got to adapt to that is something almost like, I suppose the group needs to give themselves permission to think about it as adaptation as opposed to, correction, as you said.
As you say, there's a huge difference. So, as you've just described, there's shame attached with correction.
Mhm.
Somebody's done something wrong. We are bad. And so much of this is around sort of the shame that comes with, oh my gosh, I feel like I might get in trouble, or, you're going to judge me, or what's going to happen. And anything you can do to avoid that will save you so much time and, heighten so much of your collective productivity. So, small and routine and formal and informal check ins and conversations. I truly believe that a team is measured by the quality of its conversations. And the more high quality conversations you have, as measured by, how permitted people felt to be open and honest with their ideas, their suggestions. And if it happens quick and it's like, oh my gosh, we said we were all going to be here by 9 o'clock in the morning, but look, everybody's still coming in at 10. Well, okay, so wait, guys, does it turn out that that rule actually was like, not realistic, or what's happening here? Quick, fix, keep going, as opposed to 6 months later, oh my gosh, we're just such losers.
Mhm.
So, the cost of correction is hugely high,
Mhm. Mhm.
and you don't want to get there. So, yeah, just short, continuous, keep going, let's go, we can do this, positive, generative, as opposed to, oh no, we've called a meeting because dot, dot, dot.
Mhm. And is there a balance to be struck between, maintaining, quote unquote control, right? I'll say it, versus, continuous adaptation where you suddenly end up in a place where, or you eventually end up in a place where you've lost sight of the vision or nothing is being achieved the way that, you thought that they would be achieved. And that's maybe okay, but you're just not getting the outcomes as an organization that you do need to get business wise.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the adaptations would always be framed is this helping us to create what we want better? Is this a better way? Is this better? I mean, just that constant question. I remember, having conversations around innovation and just saying it's a simple response to a question, is there a better way?
Mhm.
Can we do this better? Whatever better looks like. So I would say that would always need to be framed with how is it helping us to do the thing that we're here to do? And then I would say that the job of the people vested with the greatest sort of, responsibility for oversight in the team, that is their work
Mhm.
to kind of keep knitting together the macro and the micro and saying, okay, guys, remember, this is what we're here for. How is each one of your, actions, reactions, and adaptations helping us get there?
Right.
And you've got to be that pattern spotter. You've got to be that connector. Or if you, as most senior person, or however you want to describe it, doesn't do that, then find the person on your team who does do that really well and say, hey, Amy, can you help me just make sure that we're not losing track here of what the ultimate goal is?
Excellent. Thank you. Just before we wrap up, we have talked around the idea of this being important, very important now, and very relevant as an idea or as a framework to work within. Right now we've talked about people's roles changing and change becoming more prevalent in terms of our everyday. And as we look at what's changing over the next 3 to 5 years, there's quite a lot that people are dealing with. Could you speak a little bit more, to really the importance and the relevance of this topic right now?
Yeah. I think we're moving into a time of what I kind of describe as novel decision making. So we're going to have to potentially, and it's your being the first,
Hmm.
we're going to have to make decisions, choices that maybe are unfamiliar to us, untested. So if I get laid off, I might not just have to go and look for the same job somewhere else. I might find that my job has been replaced everywhere. So, what am I going to do about that? How am I going to permit myself to think quite differently about what my career path forward looks like, for instance? If I'm a young person and I'm looking out going, my goodness, institutional advancement is no longer a strategy for me. There are no entry level jobs, or the middle management is being cut out and replaced. So what am I going to do? I need to permit myself to think very differently about what career advancement looks like in a world where corporates may not be my best choice. All of this involves engagement with a default story that we're all carrying around about what good looks like. And for most of us, really honestly, that was moving in a seamless linear fashion through a corporate machine. And that simple strategy is now becoming outdated. That means it's time to permit ourselves to think creatively about what advancement looks like, about what success looks like. Is it going to be linear? Is it going to be seamless? Should we buckle up and expect that there will be more friction and discomfort? And that maybe that's not a terrible thing because it's in those spaces that you learn the most, that you actually gain that muscle that we've been talking about. So, I think this, as I talk about in the book, change requires permission, self permission. When you're living in a time of constant disruption, you need to embed permission into your operating system because it's the difference between you being able to evolve and adapt and take advantage of what's out there versus you holding on to the status quo for as long as you can, hoping that you've got a little bit of time left. Um, I think this idea of green lighting change and of driving our own adaptation is now becoming a 21st century requirement. It's not for the few who are, a little bit forward thinking or a little bit out there. It's a core skill set. And so that means a very different relationship to change. And it means really lighting up your own agency to make the changes that you know you need to make to ride the waves of a disruptive world.
Very helpful, I think, for many of us. Jill, thank you so much for bringing that forward. It's something that
Great.
I think a lot of people will give some thought to. And I think we are looking for and needing some of those core skill sets for the future and understanding what they are so we can put our arms around them. Jill,
Yeah.
congratulations on your upcoming book. I know it's coming out in mid September,
Thank
and
you.
so that's quite soon.
Mhm.
That's
It
exciting, and I'll
is.
be looking out for that. Just before
Mm.
we wrap up, any last words for the audience?
Yeah, I guess just, I work with people every day who I think feel overwhelmed at the moment by the amount of change that's sort of both occurring now and on the horizon. And I guess I want to say, give yourself permission to feel optimistic. See what that might feel like for you if you thought, maybe there's, great potential out there. Maybe there's great possibility for me to kind of create a path for myself that's full of meaning and growth and contribution. I think, we're very afraid now and cynical. And I'm not convinced that we can make our best contributions from a place of fear and cynicism. So I really want people to explore what optimism and hope and might feel like for them as a starting point for finding their way forward.
It almost feels like shedding off layers of unwanted clothing or something like that. It's things to,
Mm. Yeah,
unlock and shed.
so much so.
Thank you so much, Jill. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah.
And folks, if you haven't subscribed to Wired for Change, I'd encourage you to do so if you're interested in conversations about change and tools and thinking, strategy, mindsets. There's a lot to unpack and a lot that can make all of this feel better, for us and help us to move forward more quickly in the future with us and our organization. So, really appreciate your time, audience, and that's another episode of Wired for Change.